Hi, I'm Pastor Mike, and this is a response video to another video that was posted by Pastor Adam Duncan regarding last generation theology. So, Adam posted this in a private group a few days ago, and I contacted him with the possibility of having a conversation about it where we're both live discussing the subject together. But before doing that, I thought it might be best for me to do kind of a brief response video to what he has already posted, and then we can have the conversation and then maybe take things from there. So the kind of the tentative schedule for now is um, we're gonna, this is my preliminary video. We're gonna have several recorded conversations during which time we might do individual responses to those conversations and then possibly some concluding remarks after we're done, and then release this as a series of videos that people can follow along who are interested in the topic. Now, just a little bit about me. I'm basically running, I just recently started this ministry called Sola Scriptura Zoom Church. Um, among other things I'm doing there is I'm having conversations with non-Adventists regarding the Adventist theological method. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to write a document, which can be found at this address, bit.ly Sola Scriptura Manifesto. And I've tried to explain to non-Adventist theologians the rationale behind the Adventist approach to theology. And then I've shared this with several people, and then we had conversations about it that you can go to my website and my channel. All of them are labeled Sola Scriptura, so you could go to YouTube, you could go to your podcast app, or to the website itself, solascripturazoomchurch.com, and so on, and watch the interactions I have with people from other denominations within the context of this approach to explaining Adventist theology. So if you know anybody, if you have pastor friends from other denominations, if you have uh, professors at some Christian university that you're attending that's not Adventist, anybody that you have interactions with, feel free to send them my material and then invite them to chat with me about it, to kind of get a sense for how what people have to say about this approach to theology. Anyway, so that's kind of a little bit of what I'm doing right now. But I'm interested very much in the topic of last generation theology, so I thought it would be good for Adam and I to have this conversation because I think it would be um, a good resource for others as well to kind of follow along with. Okay, so the first thing I want to mention is what the two positions are. So in the video that Adam put up, he essentially, the highlights of the video are kind of summarized like this. He feels that the last generation theology idea is being misunderstood, that it's conflated with legalism when in fact it doesn't have to be legalistic. Um, what he thinks is actually happening is that legalistic people gravitate towards things like LGT, but those people would be legalistic anyway. So it's not the theology that's making them legalistic; it's who they already are, and they're just embracing this add-on to their already existing legalism. But the theology itself, the LGT theology, doesn't have anything to do with legalism. Now, as far as Emil Andreasen, who is considered the founder of last generation theology, he feels that this person has been misinterpreted and misunderstood. That his main book, The Sanctuary Service, is actually quite gospel or Christ centered, and that the chapter that has caused the most controversy, which is the last generation chapter, has been taken out of context. And if we follow the train of logic in the book as a whole, we would have no problem with the last chapter when taken within that context. And finally, um, he feels that what LGT really brings is a proper balance between law and grace, between justification, sanctification, and things like that. Now, my position on this is pretty much the opposite. I feel that the theology of last generation theology is heretical. Um, Last generation theology as a movement, because there's several components here. LGT is a theology, but it has also instigated a movement in the Adventist Church. This theology and this movement, I think, is destructive, and it has done serious damage to the denomination. Now, this theology and this moves within Adventism have been around now for almost a century. So we've had tons of time to understand it, to make sense of what it does, to see the effects of the theology in the church. So we don't have any excuse at this moment in time to be naive about it or to be uh, unsure or confused about what LGT is. It's been around way more than it should have been. It's been around long enough. Now, as far as the church itself, there's people over the past several decades that have published things against last generation theology. Probably the most famous person is George Knight, who was a former seminary professor. But just recently, I think somewhere within the last 2 or 3 years, um, the seminary put out a book called God's Character in the Last Generation, where they dissect last generation theology, and it's done by a collection of our top theologians. So if we consider the Andrews Seminary as the flagship seminary of the denomination, and we have, there's 12 different theologians that are professors at Andrews that have all contributed to this book. Um, I think it's fair to say that this is a fairly authoritative position of our top scholars as far as their position on last generation theology. But even though the seminary has put this out, the organization as a whole, so the Adventist Church as a whole, its leadership, it's the general conference in session, our overall authority structure hasn't really done anything or it has in any way brought up the issue of last generation theology or dealt with it, which I would say is concerning given that it has been around for so long. So we've had this in our church long enough to where we either embrace it or we and recognize it for what it is and let the world know that it is not something that is part of the Adventist system of thought. There's no real excuse for it to take the church 100 years to deal with something like this. It's too influential a position. It is significant. It has significant implications that it needs to be dealt with, and there's no excuse for us to be here in 2021 when Andresen was publishing this stuff in the 1930s, and for the church at large not to take a position, and then for the members to be so deeply immersed in this stuff. I mean, like I always say, if you put a map of the world on the wall and you throw randomly a dart at the wall and you go to the nearest church to wherever that dart lands on the map, there's a good chance there's going to be a significant number of people in there that have been influenced by LGT. So it's out there, it's in people's psyche, and yet the church has never really dealt with it, and that's just unacceptable in my opinion. So yeah, it is way past time to take a very clear stance, and because of this, I personally don't think it's a good idea. Speaking of Adam putting this video out, I don't think it's a good idea to come to the defense of LGT at this stage in history. Now, some of the things Adam has said, like for example, he feels that that LGT has brought about a good balance between law and grace. To me, mixing that with LGT is nonsensical because the issues, the controversy between law and grace, sanctification and justification go back for 2,000 years. So there's no point in taking a debate that has been part of the Christian conversation ever since the time of Paul. I mean, the entire New Testament, Paul, especially in the New Testament, is spending considerable time trying to establish a proper balance between law and grace. And it didn't stop with him. You could look at all of Christian history and people are discussing this issue. So calling this LGT because somebody came up with something with a label for it, 2,000 years down the line doesn't make sense. This has nothing to do with LGT. It's just a topic that's part of the Christian conversation. So if we're going to talk about LGT, we need to define LGT properly. What exactly is last generation theology? And it cannot be just finding the right balance between law and grace or finding this correct synthesis between legalism on one side and cheap grace on the other. You have this sort of dialectic where you have thesis, legalism, antithesis, cheap grace, synthesis, this sort of balanced position in the middle. And now we're calling it LGT just to give last generation theology some credence, when in fact it has nothing to do with LGT and transcends Adventism. It's part of the entire history of the Christian community's theological conversation. So what we need to do, part of the conversation we need to have Adam and I, is to clearly establish what do we mean when we talk about last generation theology. And we need to figure out how to go about doing that, because if we don't properly identify it, it just creates confusion and it creates room for heresy to squeeze in, even though we don't want it to get in there. Now, one of the tactics people use, and I think Adam unintentionally is falling for this trap, is to look at the landscape of different positions on LGT and to find the least objectionable variant of it, and to say that represents LGT and all the other ones are extreme. Uh, I don't think that's a good approach. I think we need to figure out what LGT is at its essence. And I think we need to look at it from a systematic theology approach. What exactly is the LGT system of thought? So that's what I would like to get into as we continue this conversation. Now, one of the things we can do with just about any heresy, I mean, I listed a couple here, but that's just some things that affected Adventism. We could go through any heresy in the history of the church. So, for example, we could take pantheism and Kellogg. You know, those of us that know Adventist history know that Kellogg brought in some pantheistic ideas, and the church fought him on it. And anybody could take any bad idea and look at only the positive elements of it and say, hey, it's not that bad. Like, for example, pantheism. Hey, all pantheism is about is just believing that God is with us, God is part of everything we do in everyday life. That's not such a bad thing. It's not a bad idea. So, you know, pantheism isn't really that bad. You know, we could do that with shepherd's rods. We all are familiar with the shepherd's rods who sit outside churches and try to accost people and convince them. I mean, you know, talk to them about all this, I would say, weird theology, because a lot of their stuff just makes no sense. But anyway, somebody could take shepherd's rods and say, hey, what's wrong with shepherd's rods? I mean, the phrase is taken from Psalms. You know, it's that beautiful Psalm 23, and you know, his rod and his staff, they comfort me. You know, so there's nothing wrong with it. It's just a nice concept. We shouldn't look down on it. We could take anything and present it in that light, but that doesn't help us. You know, if there's a way of thought, a system of thought that is problematic, no, let's look at the problems, let's confront it for what it actually is, instead of trying to kind of uh, dismiss it, or glance over it, or give the superficial description of it, and pretend that it's actually better than it really is. Another example I could give of this is back in the day, you know, maybe 20 years or so ago, I used to like to get into debates about evolution. I've grown up a lot since then, but one of the things I used to run into a lot is, you know, inevitably, if I'm talking to someone and I have some debate with somebody and they disagree with me about evolution, eventually somebody will jump in and say, hey, you know what evolution is? Evolution is nothing more than change over time. All it is change over time. Now, you believe things change with time, right? I mean, everything changes. You know, the more time passes, stuff changes. That's what evolution is. So you already believe in evolution. So what's the problem? You've already accepted it. You believe change happens with time, so you believe in evolution. That's it. End of story. You know. Now, yeah, things change with time, but obviously, if I was debating evolution, I wasn't debating that element of it. That's a very bad way of arguing the case for something that clearly somebody disagrees with, right? And in a sense, I think Adam is doing something similar here by taking last generation theology, which is a very complex system of ideas, and minimizing it to something simple like, um, it's getting the right balance between legalism and cheap grace or something like that, which really has nothing to do with LGT and should not be labeled as LGT. So anyway, the the point of this conversation, one of the main points of it really needs to be to figure out what is the correct definition of what we're talking about. All right, so just a little bit of background here for people that might not be familiar with the topic. Here's ML Andreasen. One of the things we need to keep in mind is that there's a difference between founders and movements, because movements evolve with time, and this happens with everybody. So, for example, you could go out throughout the entire Christian history, and you could say, okay, there's Augustine, and then there's an entire history that happened as a result of Augustine's ideas, or early in the first 4 centuries or so of Christianity. You take somebody like Aquinas. Aquinas had his theology, but then you have an entire 1,000 years after that of people building that theology and developing it into something which is kind of what, the modern version of the Catholic Church. The same thing applies to Luther. The same thing applies to Calvin and everybody else. So whenever you have somebody that introduces some idea, um, they start a trajectory of thought that affects things over a longer period of time beyond their own limited scope. So they begin something and that thing transcends them and keeps growing and keeps developing and building into something else. So we need to be careful here because we're dealing with a person, Emil Andreasen, as the founder of this LGT concept, but we need to also consider the effects of this theology over time and how the theology developed and what it means today and how it's affecting the Adventist Church. But we need to keep the connection there as well, because there's certain elements in the starting theology that affected how the theology grew after that. So there is a connection, even though it's not the same thing. So those are some things we need to keep in mind as we move on. Now, as far as Emil Andreasen, his name really means Million Lawrence Andreasen. He is Dutch, I believe. He was born in 1876. He lived in the time of Ellen White. He actually met with her several times. So he knew her personally. She knew him personally. And there's some stories there with her interaction with him. He died in 1962. So he lived almost 90 years, a good life. He was, I'm getting some of the stuff from Wikipedia just for experience's sake, but I believe several months ago I checked out some of this information is legit. So he was one of Seventh-day Adventist Church's most prominent theologians in the 1930s and 40s. So basically when he was in his 50s and 60s or so. And here's some stuff that is kind of hard to read on the slide, so I'll just read it here. Andreasen served as president of the Greater New York Conference from 1909 to 1910, president of the Hutchinson Theological Seminary from 1910 to 1918. He was dean of Atlantic Union College from 1918 to 1922. He was the dean of Washington Missionary College, which is now the Washington Adventist University from 1922 to 1924. He was the president of the Minnesota Conference 1924 to 1931, president of the Union College in Nebraska from 1931 to 1938, and field secretary of the General Conference from 1941 to 1950. He taught at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary, now located at Andrews University, from 1937 to 1950. So you can see that he had a very full life. He was very involved in the church. He was very influential. This is not just some random person that came up with some idea, but he had a significant position, multiple significant positions in the church, and he has significant influence on the denomination. Okay, so now just kind of a brief history of some of the things we're talking about and we're going to be talking about. The book that Adam mentioned in his video, it's called The Sanctuary Service. He wrote that or published that in 1937. So that's 80 years ago or so. About 10, 15, 20 years later, somewhere over the next couple of decades, something significant happened. A person named Walter Martin, who had become an expert on Christian cults, was writing a book called The Kingdom of the Cults, where he talked about the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons, the Christian Scientists, and a bunch of other aberrant groups, as they call them. And he wanted to include Seventh-day Adventists in his book. But because he felt that he needed to be fair, he contacted the denomination and wanted to get in touch with us and have a conversation with us and make sure that he's properly representing our beliefs. Now, when he did this, he ended up getting connected with Froom, who was one of the church's top theologians at that point in time. And Froom, along with a couple of other people, met with them several times, and then they agreed to publish several things kind of together, because over the period of time during which they had these conversations, Walter Martin became convinced that Adventists should not be classified as a cult, but more like a heterodox. So we're slightly different than the majority of other evangelicals, but we're still within the broader sphere of the evangelical community. So in 1957, the book called Questions on Doctrines, which has been affectionately called QOD for the past 50 years or whatever it's been, or 7 years by now. But yeah, anyway, this book was published by the church, and overall, it was Andreessen at least felt that it was a very good book with some exceptions. So Andreessen got a hold of the manuscript. He tried to get in touch with the leadership and tell them, hey, you guys are publishing certain things here that are bad. The leadership didn't want to listen to him. Eventually, Andreessen decided, there's no getting through to these people. So I'm just going to publish the set of letters to the church at large. And I'm going to let the organization, the whole Adventist community know that their leadership is going forward with publishing some things that are heretical in his opinion. Now, the topics that he felt were heretical were things like the nature of Christ, the atonement, the way they presented the atonement, and a few other things, even though the majority of the rest of the book he felt was really good. Now, Andreessen publishes this letters, these open letters. The controversy between Andreessen and the church leadership at that time, the GC president and the group of theologians that were working on questionable doctrine, the conflict between them grows to the point where in 1961 the church revokes Andreessen's ministerial credentials. After, by this time he's almost in his 80s, I guess. He was born in 1874 or something like that, right? So anyway, so he's fairly old, and they decide at this stage in life, after he's given his entire life to the service of the church, they decide to revoke his credentials. Andreessen actually doesn't have much left to live there. He dies in 1962, but towards the end of his life, he feels really bad about the condition between him and the church. So he calls the leaders and he has a conversation with them. Eventually, after he dies, the church restores his credential. And apparently things were a little better towards the end than they were during this whole period of time. Now, this is not the end of the story, because what happened as a result of this controversy between Andreessen and the rest of the leadership of the denomination is that it created this conspiracy, this sense of conspiracy. So Andreessen convinced a significant segment of the church that the Adventist leadership has apostatized, that they've actually crossed over to the evangelical side. They're bringing evangelicalism into Adventism, and as things progressed, there was a movement that started within Adventism. And this is a little bit interesting, because this is the kind of thing that usually, when this kind of thing usually happens in other churches, people just split. So, if you have, say, the Baptist denomination, there's some kind of conflict and people feel that the leadership is apostatizing from what they feel, where they feel they need to be, they just kind of break off and they start their own branch of the denomination. But in Adventism, especially in conservative circles, that doesn't work, because Ellen White has made it very clear that this church is not going to apostatize, that this church is going to go through to the end. And then it is actually the people that leave the church that are going to be apostatizing. So when you have this mentality that the church cannot apostatize, but you feel that they have and you need to break away, the only option then is to create a movement within the movement. So from this period of time, from the 1960s, we have the rise of a movement within Adventism that essentially feels like the leadership of the church has apostatized, but they cannot leave. They have to stay behind because, this is God's church and there's nowhere else to go, and they cannot start another group. So what ends up happening is that we have this divided church from this moment forward, and it's a result of the sense of a conspiracy happening at the highest levels of the church that was started by Andreessen. So Andreessen, his contribution is more than a theological position. It's actually a state or an impression, a perspective regarding the nature or the condition of the church that has been passed on to his followers, that continues till today and has had serious repercussion on the church, because there's a large segment of the church that doesn't trust leadership, doesn't trust the theologians, doesn't trust the administrators. They feel all these people are apostate, and this sort of division keeps growing with time instead of healing. And it has its basis in what Andreessen started during this period of time. And I would argue, and I don't have time to do it now, but I would argue this entire thing is a misdiagnosis on Andreessen's part. He made significant mistakes both in his theology and in his interpretation of what was happening in the church, even though I would readily acknowledge that Froome and the others, the GC president at the time and everybody else, made significant mistakes as well. But it didn't need to go to this, and yet we have an entire history from the 60s until today, and then we have other even bigger crises that develop as a result of the split in the church, that just didn't need to happen. And it's all because Andreessen misdiagnosed the situation. And the reason he misdiagnosed it is because he had his own theological glasses on that prevented him from really understanding what is happening here. Anyway, that's a long discussion that we might have as we go along with this conversation, but that's just kind of an introductory statement over here on my part. Okay, so what are some of the issues that usually get debated in this controversy or this debate about last generation theology? So the most famous one is the nature of Christ. Everybody's heard people talking back and forth about the nature of Christ. Did Jesus have a nature of Adam before the fall, or did Jesus have the nature of Adam after the fall? Another thing is, what is sin? Is sin external stuff? Is it the actions? Is it the voluntary stuff? So for example, you're tempted, whether from an external temptation or from inside of you, you're tempted, and then it comes to your conscious thought process and you make a decision that you're going to turn right or left. Is that sin? Or is sin part of your nature? So even if you're doing everything right, you're still sinning because you're just by nature evil, and you cannot help but sin just by sheer existence. So those are the two positions. And I would personally argue, not here because there's no time, but I would argue that that's a very bad way of looking at the topic altogether. So I think both of the sides in this debate are making some major mistakes. Anyway, so we have nature of sin, nature of Christ, victory over sin. There's questions about what is original sin. Is there such a thing as original sin? All these topics start to get fairly complex theologically, to the point where the average person kind of checks out because it's more than the theological level to which they're used to thinking. But they affect all these things that are in the debate here. Then you have issues of character perfection, perfection, victory over sin, complete victory over sin. Is it possible to reach perfection? Is it possible to stop sinning? All these different questions. One of the key elements that a lot of times people don't talk about, but is in fact a critical part of the LGT theology, is the idea of vindication. And I'll explain that in a minute, briefly again, because this is kind of an introduction. Then there's the question of the delay. Can we hasten or delay Christ's coming, or is that just something that God decides and it has nothing to do with us? God has set a date for his second coming and it's settled. Or can we actually contribute or cooperate with God to some degree, or actually block events from happening the way God wants it to happen? All these different questions. What I want to say here is that there are certain more recent theological breakthroughs that have given us the tools to address some of these issues in a way that we would not have been able to address back in the 1960s, because we just didn't have the understanding we have today. Unfortunately, most of the people that get involved in the LGT debate are not aware of some of these more recent theological tools that we have at our disposal. So what we really need in this debate is a set of probably doctoral students, PhD students, to go through and deal with some of these topics properly, so that we can have this conversation again and do it on a sounder basis. Because what a lot of people don't understand is the presuppositions that most of the evangelical world works with when it comes to some of these topics, nature of Christ, nature of sin, and all this stuff. And we've sort of embraced their presuppositions unawares, and it's become part of the Adventist conversation, and it's affected us when it didn't need to. So this is something we might have a chance to talk about later, but at this point, it's too much to get into. Here's something else that I think needs to be clarified regarding last generation theology, because it's something that they omit in the way they present things that causes confusion. Now, in the last generation theology's individual's mind, there's a certain growth process. So they say, a person comes to Christ, they have the new birth, they become Christians, they surrender to Christ, and then through that process of surrender, they enter a stage of spiritual growth, sanctification, and they come closer and closer to God as they overcome their sins and as they submit on a daily basis and so on. And then at some point, they reach a level where they have complete victory over sin and they reach character perfection. That's the picture that the LGT crowd presents of how this process works. But if you look at the Bible, there's actually another stage in there. You have the new birth, you have the spiritual growth, you have maturity, and then perfection. Now, the issue of perfection itself, I know, is debated, and I might come back to this. Uh, what I would argue on this is that um, we've kind of misunderstood this whole topic because of our immersion in evangelical thought patterns, and we're creating unnecessary problems for ourselves because we don't fully understand the philosophy behind it. Anyway, there's a long story there, but the point is, um, to the LGT mind, the whole thing is kind of summarized into these three stages when in fact there is such a thing as spiritual maturity. Now, what do I mean by spiritual maturity? Well, a person comes to Christ. We both sides agree to that. They when they come, they're infants in Christ. They're spiritual children. They're learning. They're perfect in Christ at that moment, but they're making a ton of mistakes, and everybody can see their mistakes because they're doing the best they can, but they obviously don't fully understand the Christian walk. And then they have a growth process. So for the next decade or 20 years or whatever it is, they continue to grow, assuming they continue to follow Christ. But they get to a stage eventually where they hopefully reach a stage of spiritual maturity. Now, this spiritual maturity is not the same thing as perfection. And I would say that I have personally met dozens, if not hundreds of people throughout the past almost 50 years now that I've been around that have reached a certain stage of spiritual maturity. And what do I mean by that? I mean that they're settled into the faith. They have their walk with God. They've had their walk with God for years or decades. They're consistent. They're stable in their walk. They don't have this ups and downs. They don't, reach some point, reach some kind of crisis, and then they abandon the faith or they give up or they get discouraged or anything. No, their walk is consistent. They're committed to Christ. They're devoted to Him and all this stuff. If there was some major crisis, they would deal with that crisis as a Christian would, as opposed to becoming discouraged or anything like that. So anyway, there is such a thing as a stage of spiritual maturity, but it's not the same thing as perfection. All the people that I've ever met who have reached this mature state of Christian experience have their faults, and if you hang out with them long enough, and if you get to know them on an intimate basis, you see that they have their problems, and you see that they make their mistakes, they have their faults, they have their sins, they still do things that that do not qualify them as having reached perfection. But that doesn't mean they're not mature in Christ, and it doesn't mean that if they had to, for example, deal with a serious crisis, like they came under persecution or they came under a situation where they had to give their life for their faith, it doesn't mean that they'll fall away and lose their faith just because they're not at that stage of perfection. So there is this other category in there that the last generation theology proponents kind of skip over. And the reason I'm saying this is because in their mind, there's this period of time at the very end when God talks about a harvest, when He talks about the 144,000 having no spot of blemish, no gall in the mouth, and all this stuff, and they interpret that stuff as meaning perfection, when in fact it doesn't have to mean perfection. It could just as well mean spiritual character maturity, or however you want to say it. And yet they completely skip over that stage and they say, well, this group of people is clearly at a different level than everybody else, so they have to be perfect. But that's not necessarily there. So anyway, I wanted to throw that in there because it's something that gets overlooked in these conversations, and it gives last generation theology proponents a chance to kind of muddy the waters on this topic. All right, so a few other things about what LGT really is. So the question now is, how do we define LGT? And here's how I think it needs to be defined. Um, Actually, there's something I skipped. So let's do this first, and then we'll go to the definition. Another problem in the LGBT discussions is the fact that um, if you look at the whole Adventist theological landscape, there's Adventism proper, which is what I would say this is the concrete Adventist theology. This is the Adventist theological system, and I label that here as this as the circle. In Adventism, especially in educated circles, so like when you're talking about people that have pastors, theologians, people that have theology degrees, in educated circles within the Adventist world, there's a lot of other positions that basically don't qualify as Adventist theology. So I think that one of the best ways to categorize is to say, okay, there's progressive Adventists, evangelical Adventists, and historic Adventists. Now, progressive Adventists are the Adventist equivalent of the more liberal side of the Christian world. So it's people that have been influenced by modern ways of thinking, whether it's scientific things like um, just modern scientific thought, modern culture, liberal theology, modern philosophy. Uh, they're big on higher criticism or critical scholarship, all these different things. They essentially, like, if you look at the Christian world in general, outside of Adventism, you have the more conservative side and the more liberal side. So that has had an impact on the church as well. So you have progressive Adventists who kind of resonate with this more liberal side of the Christian world. And then you have evangelical Adventists who resonate with the more conservative side of the evangelical world, which, it's people that are big on things like the Reformation, on the historic Christian church, orthodoxy, as they call it. They're big on justification. They're big on assurance of salvation. Those are the things that are of interest to them. So these groups are different in a sense than the progressives who have kind of other concerns. And then on the other side, you have the historic Adventists who are very big on the Adventist um, approach to things, going back to the pioneers, very big on Ellen White. LGT is part of this group of people. It's part of this tradition. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because almost every time you have a conversation about last generation theology, all these groups get involved. And they get involved to the point that it's almost impossible to figure out where Adventism is within this bigger conversation. Essentially, Adventism is being choked out because you have the progressives who argue against the LGBT people, and then the evangelical Adventists who argue against the LGBT people. So it's like it creates this false dichotomy, though, as you would say. Like it's essentially both sides or all the sides involved make it seem like it's either their way or the opposite side of the story. So, for example, people on the historic Adventist side of the question, whether they're LGBT or not, but they're on the extreme conservative Adventist side of things, whenever they make their case, they're actually arguing against the position of either the progressives or the evangelical Adventists. They're not arguing against Adventism proper. So their argument is kind of like, if you don't take our position, you're going to end up like those guys. And the same thing with evangelical Adventists or progressive Adventists. They argue as if you don't agree with them, you're going to end up with the historic side of things, which to them is cultish and so on, and it's got its problems. But the thing is, all these perspectives are bad. Historic Adventism, including LGT and a bunch of other groups that we can get into at some point, they have serious problems. So do progressive Adventists, so do evangelical Adventists. They don't represent the Adventist position. All these groups are misrepresenting Adventism, and yet their conversation is so overwhelming that nobody even knows what Adventism has to say about this. It's all these other groups, to the point where we're essentially like the actual center of Adventist theology is eclipsed by all these other groups trying to butt into the conversation. So I think we need to have a conversation about last generation theology with a clear starting position of what Adventism is all about, and then we can evaluate the claims of last generation theology from there, from within that context. Um, And we cannot allow LGT and LGT proponents to keep conflating Adventism with either progressives or evangelicals in the church, because these groups are equally heretical, as you might say. And I'm not saying heretical here in a sense that, okay, if you're a progressive Adventist, you're going to hell or any of that stuff. I'm just saying they don't represent the Adventist position. So within the context of Adventism, these are outside groups. It's kind of like trying to have a conversation with other Christians about what the Bible teaches and the gospel or whatever, and then some Buddhists and Muslims and Hindus get into the conversation and they want to have their side represented. No, we're talking about Christian issues here. Let's stick with whatever we have to do with other Christians. Our conversation has to deal with issues regarding Christianity. We don't need all this other groups to have their position represented here. Here, we're talking about the Adventist position, and we need to evaluate last generation theology from within the Adventist context. So let's just stick with the Adventist context and not have the conversation going all over the place and having to deal with all these different people's objections because they don't represent what Adventism is all about. Anyway, I know a lot of people are going to have issues with this. I could do a separate video on what I mean by this in more detail, but obviously that's beyond the scope of this introductory presentation. Okay, so now LGT, what is last generation theology and how do we label it? So I created this pyramid because all these things are things that can be part of the last generation theology conversation, but I would argue that they're not and should not be labeled as LGT proper. So the first stage is what Adam was talking about, is the question of law versus grace, justification versus sanctification, forgiveness of sin versus victory over sin. This question has been around since the beginning of the Christian era. It has been debated millions of times, way beyond Adventism, before we were even around. It has nothing to do with Andreasen. It's not his thing, and it should not be used as what LGT is all about. No, LGT has to be something more than this. Otherwise, we wouldn't be calling it LGT. We would just be calling it, the gospel. Now, above that is the question of perfection. But it's not perfection the way it's usually presented. It's the question of perfection as a possibility. So what does this mean? How do we understand this question? Well, the easiest way to put it is like this. Throughout the entire history of the human race, since Adam and Eve fell until today, with the exception of Jesus, is it possible that at least one human being had reached a level where they stopped sinning? Okay? If you put the question that way, if the person answers no, it's not possible for any single human being that ever lived to have come to a place where they stop sinning, what they're making is actually a philosophical argument. They're making an argument regarding their metaphysical understanding of human nature, right? And if they're making that argument, we need to get into the philosophy, into the metaphysics of what they're talking about and figure out why they're saying it. But with the Bible alone, I don't think anybody can prove that it's not possible for any human being to have ever reached a stage where they stop sinning unless they presuppose certain philosophical categories into the argument. And again, that's a huge debate. But what I want to emphasize here is that there's another level at this stage in the conversation, and I didn't want to go to that slide. There's a level behind some of the stuff LGT people keep talking about, and that's the idea of perfection as a possibility. And it is possible to affirm the possibility of character perfection without affirming LGT. And LGT needs to be something more than that. For one reason, because this transcends Adventism as well. You have Methodism, you have throughout the history of the Christian church, you have people that bring up this idea of victory over sin and of perfection. It's not an Adventist thing. It's definitely not an Andreasen thing. Adventists talked about it before. Methodists talked about it. It is not something that can be considered a novel idea that Andresen brought to the table, and it cannot be considered what LGT is all about because that's part of Adventism regardless. The idea that perfection is a possibility. People might disagree with this idea, and that's fine. But what I'm saying is this idea by itself should not be seen as or labeled as last generation theology because it transcends anything to do with Adventism. Okay, so now we get into kind of a more unclear territory, I would say, but I think we can still move forward with that anyway. So the next stage is the idea of the close of probation as a requirement. So is perfection required after the close of probation? So when probation closes, does everybody that is still alive that is going to be saved need to be perfect, sinless at that point in time? Or if, to say it differently, is somebody going to be lost if they commit one more sin after probation has closed? Okay, that's maybe a way to clearly ask the question. And there's two ways to answer that. Some people in the Adventist Church, and I believe somebody fairly well known, such as Marvin Moore, who has been writing, is a very prolific author in the church, takes the position, and I could be wrong, but that's my understanding of what he has to say. He takes the position that people do have to be perfect after the close of probation, but that is something that God does. So it's basically a miracle that God does, and it has nothing to do with us in the sense that we don't need to stress out about it. If we're committed to God, if we're surrendered now, when probation closes, he'll make sure that we're sinless from that point on. And, he's going to get us through to the end. So we don't have to concern ourselves with whether we're going to commit one more sin after probation closes. So that's one position. The other position is to say, no, we need to be sinless after the close of probation, but that's something we have to do. So we do have to worry about it. We need to continuously grow spiritually, or otherwise we will not be ready when probation closes. We'll commit one more sin, and that's going to keep us out of heaven. So that itself is another position. And I would say even that should not be labeled as LGT, because LGT goes a step further. And now I'll come back to this slide so a little bit later. LGT goes a step further and says, no, it's not just that, but we have to be perfect after the close of probation because we need to do something. We need to vindicate God, because unless this happens, God cannot win the great controversy. So I would argue that that is the position that we need to label LGT, because we need to address that position head on, and we need to deal with it as a church. Do we as a church believe that people need to reach perfection after the close of probation to help God win the great controversy, or however you want to say that? Anyway, we can discuss all that in subsequent videos, but I want to establish what the possible categories are here. Okay, so how do I organize them? I say, if you're working with the Bible alone, which is what I would argue has to be the Adventist position. So one of the biggest problems with last generation theology and with historic Adventism in general is that they use Ellen White in establishing their theological positions, which, not because of any issue with Ellen White herself, but as a basis for theology, I would argue that the Adventist position has to be Bible only. But if you're working with the Bible only, I would argue that the only two positions in this pyramid that you can support are the first one, justification and sanctification, and perfection as a possibility. You could support those two positions with the Bible only. The next two positions, perfection as a requirement after the close of probation, whether it's God's doing or our doing, you need to use Ellen White to argue for that position. Now, I know some people are going to say, no, I can argue with that from the Bible alone. But I almost guarantee you that the reason you think you could argue this position with the Bible alone is because you have your Ellen White built glasses in your head, or your LGT built glasses in your head, your lenses through which you read the Bible, and you superimpose these things on the Bible when the ideas are not actually there. And again, that's a whole other conversation. But what I would say is that is not LGT yet. LGT proper should be categorizing only this idea of vindication. And I will argue that that position is a heretical position. And I'll explain why in a minute. But we should be careful with our labels and not broaden them to the point where it includes all these other things that are easily defended, just so that we can give legitimacy to a position that really doesn't deserve it. Okay, so I would say LG proper has to do with this idea of vindication. So let's discuss what this means. What is the vindication motif? Well, to properly understand this, we need to do a little bit of history or think a little bit about history. Now, one of the things we in this generation as Adventists, it's hard for us to relate to is what it was like for the first generation of Adventists to get old and to see the pioneers dying off the scene, including Ellen White. And the reason we don't think about this stuff is because we've been desensitized with the passing of time. I mean, from the early 1900s, every other generation of Adventists that was born way after people initially thought Jesus was going to come. So they had to make peace with that. We all grew up with the sense that, hey, time has passed. It's a lot later than we thought it would be, and Jesus still hasn't come, and it is what it is. So we need to find a way to reconcile that idea in our heads and move on with our theological perspectives and our Adventist understanding of theology and find a way to deal with it. But the generation that actually lived through that era had a crisis of faith that revolved around the passing of time. So, and sometimes it's hard to understand why, because it's hard for us to understand how they related to the 1844 disappointment. Now, to do that, we need to go back even further to the early church. So, in the early church, you have Jesus telling his disciples, "Listen, I'm going away. I'll prepare a place for you, and I'll come back and get you." So you see, even from the time of the early apostolic writings, the epistles of Paul, Peter, and John, and everybody else, they're constantly talking about Christ's soon return. And in fact, Paul has to write a letter in Thessalonians, Second Thessalonians, where he explains to people, listen, don't think Jesus is coming back right away. There's some things that still need to happen. So don't be so anxious thinking it's going to happen any second now. Because even people at the time were already anticipating the second coming. So this is 2,000 years ago, and people were anticipating the second coming. They had no idea that so much more history was going to pass. So you have this expectancy early on in Christian history, and then as time progresses, you see a change. And by the time the Roman Empire fell and Christianity became the accepted empire, there was a shift in attitudes to where people had to start making peace with the idea that Jesus wasn't coming right away. They expected him to come really soon after his ascension, and yet a century passed, the second century passed, and people started saying, look, Jesus might not come right away. And then they had to adapt their theology to make sense of that. So they started thinking, well, maybe what's happening is that the church first needs to take over to start conquering the world. So here you have the Roman Empire. The empire collapsed. It converted to Christianity. It used to persecute Christians. Now the empire is Christian. And maybe what has to happen is for the church to keep growing and growing until it takes over the whole world. And then once the church takes over the world, they have this millennium of peace. And then Jesus will come, and you'll be like this sort of seamless transition between heaven and earth, because the church has so engulfed the world that everybody's nice to everybody and everybody's loving already because they're all converted, they're all Christians, everybody's doing great. And now Jesus comes here, and it's like he's basically just moving from heaven to earth as if it's the same thing, because the world is such a better place. This is the kind of thing people were imagining at that early period in Christian history. And unfortunately, when we know history, it didn't happen. I mean, the empire became Christian, and we had a Christian world for the next millennium, at least in that part of Europe, and things weren't good. I mean, the situation wasn't at all what people imagined that it would be. But anyway, that's the kind of mindset that people had. Now, later in history, after the Reformation and coming closer to the 1800s, there was a revival of premillennialism now. People were reading the prophecies. They were starting to understand this falling away. They were starting to understand this period of time during which the Catholic Church would basically take over Christianity, and there will be this dark ages period, the little horn of Daniel, all this stuff. By the time we get to William Miller, he understands the prophecies of 1844, So what they're starting to imagine is that no, this idea that the world's going to start getting better and better was wrong. And what actually happened is that God shielded the first generation of Christians because he didn't want to discourage them by revealing to them the fact that history was going to be prolonged. And yet, through prophecy, he still got that point across to us by helping us understand, now that we have the ability to decipher the prophecies, to understand that history was actually meant to continue at least another 1500 years or so, because there was going to be this falling away, and the man of sin would come on the scene, and he would last for 1260 years and all this stuff. So they're putting the prophecies together, and they're coming to the Spirit, and they're saying, well, all that stuff has already happened. So now we're getting to the point where there's no reason for any more delay. Jesus is ready to come. So Miller preaches the second coming of Christ. That doesn't happen. Adventists come on the scene and they understand the sanctuary message. And what they understand in that is the idea that Jesus didn't come in 1844, but what did happen is the investigative judgment started, and this during this period of time, which is essentially the closing inventory. So basically, there's this great controversy. God gives the world several thousand years in which for sin to be unfolded and all this stuff, for people to, the universe to have a chance to understand the consequences of sin. But he set a point in time and said, okay, history needs to go this long, but after 1844, there's no need to prolong history any longer. We just need to have this closing inventory where we kind of evaluate everything that happened so far, all the data, all the things that has been accumulated for 6,000 years of sin, and then Jesus is ready to come. So Adventists, in deciphering the prophecies, are coming with this mindset that history is very near to its end. It wasn't 1844, but that's because that's when the investigative judgment started, the closing inventory thing started. And we still have this message to warn the world so that they could be ready for the second coming. So we have to go out and let people know that, we're in the time of the judgment, and this is it. This is basically the very time of the end, and Jesus is about to come. Now, this generation of the pioneers, the earliest Adventist pioneers, they lived with this idea that this final period between 1844 and the second coming had to be relatively short, because it didn't make sense to go and tell the world, hey, the judgment has started, get ready, Jesus is about to come, if we're going to have to wait another several hundred years. So part of their way of thought was that Jesus was about to come within their lifetime. So as history progressed, and you have all the early pioneers, getting old and dying, and then by the 1920s, even Ellen White is dead, you have a generation of Adventists that are somewhat perplexed as to why history has still continued this long and why Jesus hasn't come yet, after we've been going around telling the world that this is it. This is like that last few years between the closing judgment and the second coming, and it's time. It's time for everybody to get ready because Jesus is coming. Here we are yet again about to be disappointed in a sense because things went further than we expected them to. And within this context, Andreasen comes on the scene, and he actually provides a solution, a theological solution to this dilemma. And we need to understand LGT from this perspective, because it is a theological answer to the question of why Jesus stayed longer than Adventists initially expected him to stay. In a sense, it actually throws off our theology. I mean, were we right about 1844? Is all this stuff that we believed correct? It seems that if we were correct about that, Jesus should have come somewhere in the 1800s or at least the early 1900s. It doesn't seem like there will be a reason to prolong history any further if, in fact, the final judgment started in 1844 and God was ready to come back after that. Okay, so Andreasen comes on the scene at this period in time, and he tries to introduce a solution. And what is the solution? His solution is that there needs to be one more thing that needs to happen before Jesus could come, and that is that there needs to be a group of people that fully overcome Satan in the same sense that Jesus overcame him when he was on earth. Jesus came, he had a sinful flesh, he resisted all the temptations of Satan without falling into sin, and that's how he overcame Satan then. But now there needs to be a group of people, the 144,000, and they need to gain victory over sin. And then probation is going to close. So in Andreessen's mind and the mind of other LGBT proponents, God takes away the safety net and says, okay, Satan, go for it. You have these people just like you had Jesus in the wilderness and Jesus throughout his whole life on earth. Go at them, do the best you can, try to tempt them, try to get them to fall. If they fall, I lose the great controversy and you win it. If you cannot make them fall, no matter what you do with them, like with Job, push them as far as you can. If they resist, if they gain the victory and that they refuse to give in to your temptations, then you lose the great controversy, and I was right all along. And that's how it all ends. So the reason, according to Andreessen, that Jesus has not been able to come yet is because this final generation of people isn't ready. For whatever reason, we don't have enough people so that God can finally allow Satan to do this final experiment and settle the issues in the great controversy. Okay, so this idea of this final battle between good and evil, this final vindication of God, I would argue has to be what we mean when we talk about LGBT, because it's a significant concept. It's a system of thought that is meant to address some serious problems that arise from the nature of Adventist theology and from the way we understood things like 1844 and the sanctuary and all these other issues. So we need to look at it in that context, and then we need to ask the question, is this a legitimate explanation? Does Andreessen have a legitimate idea here that there has to be this final battle between good and evil, and this group of people have to win this battle against Satan so that the great controversy, the issues in the great controversy could be settled once and for all, and the universe for the rest of eternity could be secured against sin and against evil coming up again and all this stuff. This is the issue at stake. This is what needs to be understood when we're talking about LGBT, and this idea needs to either be embraced or needs to be rejected. And I've argued in other places, and we'll probably come back to this, that basically this idea just doesn't work. It doesn't add up on many different levels, and because of this, the entire LGBT system of thought falls apart. And all the other elements that we've talked about before, independent of this idea, should not be labeled LGBT. There's something else, whether they're right or wrong, they have nothing to do with what LGBT really is about. So anyway, this, I believe, needs to be what the conversation is about when it comes to the question of last generation theology. And I would argue that because Andreessen, he had these theological mistakes that he made regarding this particular idea of vindicating God by victory over sin. He made some massive theological mistakes here, and these mistakes affected how he viewed every other issue in the discussion, the issue of nature of Christ, the issue of nature of sin, how he viewed Fromme's conversations with Walter Martin and the book Questions on Doctrines, and how he interpreted their refusal to talk to him about it, and everything else. And it's affected generations of Adventists afterwards. It all boils down to this theological idea. So this is the epicenter of what needs to be discussed. And I would say informed Adventist thinkers need to recognize that this idea just falls apart. It doesn't work. The essence, the core of this theology doesn't work. And it affects the whole gamut of everything else that is discussed when it comes to last generation theology. All right, so coming back to this picture again, we can definitely have a conversation about this other two stages here that I label close of probation requires perfection, either by God or by us. We can discuss how that fits in the context of LGBT, but I would say that conversation needs to happen after we've settled the issue of the vindication part of it. So that's why I broke it down this way. And I think this is sort of the framework that we need to approach this debate in, because otherwise we end up confusing the issues. We end up misapplying labels to the point where nobody really knows what we're talking about. We can say LGBT is anything, or LGBT just means, you gotta You got to surrender to God. Great. Why call it LGT? We all agree that we need to surrender to God. It has nothing to do with LGT. We need to be careful how we define it and how we look at the topic systematically and deal with it, and then either embrace it as a denomination or move on, reject it and move on and find something better. And I think there's much better ways to look at all these issues that we're discussing here that don't require us to embrace just strange and nonsensical theological concepts that I personally don't think are needed and useful in the least. Okay, so hopefully with that, it kind of becomes my intro video to this conversation, and then hopefully Adam and I will continue from here by having live interaction and record our interactions and post those as well. All right, well, thank you and God bless.